So first, let's talk about this article that you all read. Online privacy plan. Questions loom. This article discussed current regulation that is under consideration at the Federal Trade Commission. And if you remember from the lecture last week about advertising law, the Federal Trade Commission is one of those bodies that is tasked with regulating businesses in the United States. And so there are two competing groups that this article talks about. One of those groups, see if we can get this working here. Right, so one of these groups is privacy advocates, and they are lobbying the FTC to create new regulations. And if you remember from the lecture from last week when we talked about advertising law, that is one of the things that progressive groups will tend to do, is lobby for increased regulation. And so there are privacy advocates that are saying, we need this increased regulation. There needs to be a way that people can change a setting in their internet browsers so that when they visit websites, their behavior is not tracked. And this is very common. A lot of advertisers, I think the article says about 80% of web advertisements use some kind of behavioral tracking. How many of you have been on Amazon.com and you'll buy an item or you'll be looking at an item, and the next time you log in to Amazon.com, it pops up and says, these are the items you recently looked at. Seen that? That uses tracking cookies on your computer to track the behavior that you have done in previous browsing sessions, and then it uses that information to target you with advertisements in the future. And so these privacy groups are saying, no, we should be able to opt out of this. On the other side, advertisers are saying, you know what, we can do a pretty good job of policing ourselves. And you'll remember from that lecture last week that that is the common stance of the advertising industry. They don't want regulation. Regulation is expensive for them. It's hard for them to keep up with. It requires them to dedicate a lot more people to just making sure that they're in compliance with regulation, and it distracts them from the primary mission of their business, which is to make money by selling advertisements to customers. So there are these two competing factions, if you will, that this article talks about. Some saying we want this ability to opt out. We don't want advertisers to track what we do online and use that to send us relevant advertisements. Others saying, look, we'll police ourselves. We'll give consumers the ability to opt out, but don't let them do it in a really easy way. And they provide some reasons why they think it should not be really easy to opt out of that. And I'll leave that to the article for you to read. Now, it's important to know that do not track doesn't mean you're not going to see advertisements anymore. It just means that those advertisements are not going to be based on your previous browsing behavior. Another thing is that each impression is less valuable to an advertiser if they're not able to track what you've done in the past. And the reason is, we know this from all of the classes that we've had before this, we've been talking about the importance of customizing advertisements. The more you can identify your target market and deliver relevant ads to your target market, the more likely it will be that that ad will be effective. And so for advertisers, if they can say, look, this person has already looked at products similar to the one you're trying to sell, show them this advertisement. That kind of impression, that's what it's called in the web advertising world, it's called an impression whenever a person views your ad or has it displayed on their screen. That impression is more valuable to them if they know that you are already likely a part of their target market. So what are some key questions that you should be able to answer from this article for the exam? First, what is the difference between a contextual ad and a behavioral ad on the internet? I'll give you the answer to this one. A contextual ad is one that is displayed next to content that you are viewing at a given time. So if you go and are reading an article about hemorrhoids and you have a hemorrhoid ad on the screen right next to you, that is a contextual ad. The advertisers are assuming that if you're reading an ad about hemorrhoids, it's probably because you're experiencing some discomfort in the posterior region and you may be inclined to purchase some kind of hemorrhoid ointment. A behavioral ad, on the other hand, actually looks at all of your behavior that you have exhibited on a given seller's website, or perhaps even across multiple websites, and then delivers ads that you are likely to be interested in. Second question you should be able to answer for the exam. Why are behavioral ads worth more to advertisers? Touched on that a little bit already. And third, what are the negative outcomes for consumers that advertisers claim might happen if a large number of consumers opt out? And there's one key one that the article talks about. You should be able to answer that as well for the exam. Well, let's move on to the lecture for today. This is lecture 7B. If you have Jake's version of the slides, I've put a new version of the slides up on Blackboard. They don't differ very much, so if you just have Jake's, that's fine. You'll be able to follow along. If you want to pull down the new version, that's available on Blackboard right now. So today we're going to be talking about heuristics. This is a really interesting topic, I think, and it's one that has implications that reach far beyond the world of advertising. Let's start with a little bit of background information. So psychologists have identified two primary modes of decision making, or two primary models by which people make decisions. The first model is one in which an individual considers an issue at length and makes a rational decision based on that existing evidence. So you can see this, this fine and new Lenovo ThinkPad laptop right up here. I just got this week, and I did a lot of research before I bought this computer. I was waiting for the new models to come out, and I spent probably 3 months looking at reviews and pre-product reviews and reviews of the processor that was in it, reviews of some of the other items that were related to this particular model of laptop computer. Spent a lot of time. I considered all the alternatives. I looked at other brands of laptops that were competing in this particular segment. And ultimately, I made the decision to purchase the ThinkPad T420. That was a very, what we call, systematic way of processing that information. Okay, so systematic decision making occurs when you look at all of the available evidence, you evaluate it, and you ultimately make a decision using more formalized rules of logic and inference. The other way that we often make decisions, and we do this a lot, is where we make a quick decision based on some principle. Okay, this is called heuristic decision making. My wife, for example, when she gets ready to buy a new laptop, she will just buy whatever I recommend. She doesn't care. She knows that I know a lot about computers, and so whatever I recommend to her that she purchase, that's what she'll get. That is a heuristic way of making the decision. Now, we'd like to believe that most of the time we make decisions based on systematic processing. We want to think that we're thoughtful people and we care a lot about the decisions that we make, and so we consider all of the evidence and we evaluate it and weigh it and make our decisions in a very systematic way. But in reality, a lot of judgments that we make on a daily basis are based on heuristics. These heuristics are basic principles that help us make sense of the world. So let's talk about those. A heuristic principle, I'll give you a clear definition. It's a simple decision rule. So, for example, some common heuristics. And when I use the term common heuristics, I mean heuristics that most people use. One of those, if you remember back to the lecture on balance theory, one common heuristic that balance theory sort of explicates a little bit is the idea that people I like usually have correct opinions. So you remember that triangle? People I like should think like me. That's a heuristic. We assume that people we like have correct opinions. And so when we're faced with a situation where a person that we like has a certain opinion, we're more inclined to agree with that opinion because we think that people we like should have correct opinions. Another common heuristic is that visual clarity reveals spatial distance. So the more sharply you can see an object, the more clearly it appears to be, or the closer it appears to be. If you've ever been in a car, you'll notice that the passenger side window always has this little warning on it. Objects in mirror are closer than they appear. Why is that? Well, the reason is we have this heuristic that if an object is smaller, it is further away. And those mirrors on the passenger side, in order to give you a reasonable field of vision, functionally shrink the image down. And so if you look in that mirror, you see the small image, you might not realize that the semi that looks like a tiny little toy car in the mirror is actually very close to you. That is a situation where the heuristic that we use can lead to systematic errors that could actually kill you, right? So in this particular case, we have this warning to remind you, look, you can't use this heuristic in this particular case, or you might get flattened by a semi. There are also what I like to call idiosyncratic heuristics. These are heuristics that an individual person might use to make decisions. So for example, my wife, when she will buy whatever computer I suggest she buys, that's an idiosyncratic heuristic. It's specific to her. There may be other people who also will buy whatever computer I recommend, but probably not nearly as many as people who would use the heuristic. People I like usually have correct opinions. So for example, Sony TVs are reliable. That might be a heuristic that someone might use when deciding what type of television to purchase. Before I got married and had a wonderful wife who buys my clothes for me, I used to have this heuristic that the closing combinations on store displays represent sound fashion choices. I'll be honest, I am not a great dresser. And so when I would have to go into the stores and buy clothes, I would often just look at what the display mannequins were wearing, and I would assume that if they put it on the display mannequins, it was probably a good combination. I could buy that outfit and wear it without any problems. Well, unfortunately for me, this was a bad heuristic because I ended up with some really ridiculous looking outfits that once I got home and my friends saw me wear them, they were just like, you cannot wear that. That looks horrible. So we have these situations where heuristics will often lead us down the wrong path. And we're going to talk today about 3 specific situations where heuristics can lead to poor decision making. Heuristics, though, are useful. And I don't want you to get the idea during this lecture that heuristics are a bad thing. The truth is that heuristics are very useful. It would be impossible to consider at length and carefully evaluate the evidence to come to a systematic decision about every issue or choice that we make. So heuristics simplify the task of assessing probabilities, predicting values, and making decisions. And there are key reasons why we use heuristics. First, we use heuristics because of limited time. In 2007, Cornell University did a study where they found that, on average, people make 221 decisions every day just related to food. I'll say that again. So, 2007, they did this study. They found that people make an average of 221 decisions every day just related to food. So you can imagine, if that's all of the decisions that we make in a given day about food, that if you do anything more than eat during the day, you're obviously going to be making potentially thousands of decisions. We simply don't have the time to systematically process information for every decision we make. But there's also an issue of energy. You've heard of this term mental drain. Cognitive effort actually is effort, and you will run out of energy if you're trying to systematically process every decision that you make. The third reason we use heuristics is because of interest. Some decisions just aren't very interesting. If you find yourself systematically processing every decision you make, you'll get bored really quickly. So, for example, one of the decisions I made this morning, I loaded my dishes from breakfast into the dishwasher, and I had to decide if I was going to run the dishwasher now, or if I was going to wait until I'd put in the dishes from dinner. So if I were to systematically process this, okay, so on the one hand, if I wash it now, then when I get home, I'll have all of my dishes in the house will be clean. And that will be really nice. But on the other hand, there's still some room in there. I could probably put my dinner dishes in there, and I'm bored already. So do you see? There is a factor of interest. if it's not interesting, we're not going to want to elaborate and make that systematic decision all of the time. So decisions are often made on heuristics. And ultimately, I decided that I would wait to do the dishwasher because I like to empty it in the morning. So I'll wait until dinner, I'll put in the dinner dishes, and do it in the morning. So that's my heuristic. I like to empty the dishwasher in the morning. We also have this issue of capacity. Our cognitive resources are limited. And if you'll remember, Jake likes to talk about this librarian in our brain who is constantly running around in the stacks trying to get the information that we need to do the various things that our brain does. And that librarian is overworked. You're only going to be providing more work for that librarian if, for some reason, we were systematically processing every decision that we make. So, these 4 reasons we use heuristics because we have limited time, limited energy, limited interest, and limited capacity. So here's where we are. Generally, heuristics are a good thing. They're useful, and we couldn't function in the world without them. But there are times, and there are certain cases, where heuristics lead to severe errors in judgment. So for example, let's return to this idea of visual clarity reveals spatial distance. Do you have any pilots in the room? Anybody who's a pilot or an aspiring pilot? Okay, so pilots, answer a question for me. What do you do, or how do you behave differently when visibility is poor? Say it again? Use your instruments. You have to rely on the instruments. Why do you have to rely on the instruments? You can't see, and even if you can see a little bit, you can't trust what you can see, right? So is there like what's the distance that you have to be able to see in order to fly with visual cues rather than your instruments? 1 mile. So you have to be able to see a mile ahead of you, or you must use your instruments. Is that what you're saying? Because the heuristics that we would use to process that visual information could lead to serious errors in judgment. It could ultimately kill you, it could kill the people on your plane. So today we're going to talk about 3 specific heuristics that matter: representativeness, availability, and adjustment and anchoring. And we'll talk about the basic idea of the heuristic and specifically some problems, the specific predictable errors that people make when using each of these heuristics. So let's start with the representativeness heuristic. The basic idea of this is if A and B are similar in one case, they are similar in all cases. Let me give you some specific examples. Stereotyping is one of the problems that can occur when we use the representativeness heuristic. And let's say that you saw a picture of this man and you knew that a former neighbor said this about him. So someone who lived next door to him said this. Said, Eric is very shy and withdrawn. He's helpful, but he has little interest in people or the world of reality. He's meek and very tidy. He has a need for order and structure and a passion for detail. So then they ask, what is the probability that Eric is a farmer, a salesman, a pilot, a librarian, or a physician? What do you say? What do you think Eric is? I'm hearing lots of different things. Whatever you've decided, here's how you've done it. You've used a stereotype of what you think a farmer or a salesperson or a pilot or a librarian should be like, and you've compared this description of Eric to this stereotype. And so people assess the degree to which a description fits a stereotype for each occupation. Now, people forget that librarian from this list is probably the least likely answer, even though in a study that used this exact scenario, it was found that most people decided that Eric was a librarian. Most likely, though, he's not, and here's why. If you look at the number of people in the U.S. that hold each of these positions, librarian is way, way, way down on the list. And this description is wholly based on the characteristics and descriptors that could describe anyone in any of these professions. So stereotyping is one thing, one systematic error that we can engage in as a result of heuristics. The second one is misconceptions of regression. This occurs where original results are thought to be completely predictive of future results. I'm going to start by teaching you a little bit about scientific history. So the friendly-looking gentleman in the photograph here is Sir Francis Galton. Any of you have heard of Sir Francis Galton? Probably not many of you. Sir Francis Galton was a geneticist, and in his studies of genetics, he discovered several statistical principles that are the foundation of modern statistical analysis techniques. Now, Sir Francis Galton, as you can probably tell by the friendly expression on his face, spent a lot of time studying sweet peas. And he did that because he was a geneticist, and he could look at the influence of successive plantings of sweet peas very quickly because they grow quickly. And so one of the studies that he did was he would grow a crop of sweet peas, he would measure the size of the peas, then he would plant those peas, grow another crop, measure the size of the peas, plant those peas, grow another crop, measure the size of those peas, and he did this over and over and over and over again. And what he discovered was this idea that if he had a particularly large generation of peas, that the following generation of peas planted from those seeds would tend to be a little bit smaller than the large peas. And he found that if he had a generation of peas that were particularly small, that the children, if you will, of those peas would tend to be a little bit bigger than the small peas. And he called this phenomena regression toward the mean. And that means that in any given situation, things will tend toward the average, the mean, the mathematical average. He did this with height as well. And he found that extremely tall parents will tend to have tall children, but their tall children will be slightly shorter than the extremely tall parents. In the same way, extremely short parents will have short children, but they'll be somewhat taller. They'll be closer to the average of the population as a whole. This is not just true, though, in genetics and biology. This is true in a lot of different areas. So, for example, numerous studies have been done in the education arena. And it turns out that if you give a large group of individuals an exam and look at their scores and take the top students and the bottom students in terms of their performance on the test and give them a second exam that covers the same material and is of equal difficulty, the best students from the first exam will tend to do somewhat worse on the second exam, and the worst students from the first exam will tend to do somewhat better on the second exam. And the reason for this is this phenomena of regression toward the mean. People and situations and events and any kind of situation tends to go toward the average. So, you'll see this warning a lot. Past performance is not completely predictive of future results. And that was the ultimate finding of this idea of regression toward the mean. Just because you do really well on one exam does not mean you will do just as well on a similar exam given at a later time. In fact, regression toward the mean would say that you will probably do worse. You will move toward the average score. The third misconception or problem with the representativeness heuristic are misconceptions of chance. And this occurs when people expect that a sequence of random events will represent the essential characteristics of that process, even when the sequence is short. So, what are the essential characteristics of a coin flip? First, if the coin is fair, then it's random. There should be no relationship between one flip and the next, right? The second is that it should be half heads and half tails on average, right? If it's a fair coin. So let's say we flipped a coin 6 times and we got heads, 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 tails, tails, tails. It turns out that we have this heuristic that even a short sequence of events should replicate the essential characteristics of that event. So we feel like this is not a very likely outcome. Heads, 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 tails, 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 because that violates our expectation that the process is random, and that seems like a pattern. Same thing with this result. If we got heads, 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 tails, heads, that violates our expectations that it should be about half heads and half tails. And so we would think that this would not be a very likely result. We're much more comfortable with something like heads, tails, tails, heads. That seems like it's fulfilling the characteristics that we know to be present if we were to flip a coin an infinite number of times. But the problem is that the third sequence here, heads, tails, heads, deviates systematically from chance expectation because it contains too many alternations and too few runs. It's true that if you flip a coin an infinite number of times, it will be heads half the time and tails half the time. But if you're only looking at 6 flips, that characteristic of the process itself is not necessarily going to be duplicated in a very short sequence. We also have what's called the gambler's fallacy. If you've ever been to Vegas, go watch the roulette wheel a while. You'll hear people saying things that indicate they believe in the gambler's fallacy. And that is this. Say you're playing roulette, and you see red come up 6 times in a row. We have this almost internal belief that once there's been a long run of red, the next one has got to be black because it's got to balance out in some way. This is the gambler's fallacy because you'll know, if you've ever taken a class in probability or elementary statistics, that each of those roulette runs, red or black, is an independent event. And it doesn't matter what happened before. It's a 50% chance of red or black coming up every time you throw the ball on the roulette wheel. What happened previously has no impact on the outcome of each subsequent trial. There's a 50% chance of red and a 50% chance of black on every spin. So, let's talk about the second heuristic, and that is availability. This is a really common heuristic. And this is talking about the ease to which an instance can be brought to mind is indicative of its probability or frequency. So think back to the librarian that runs your brain. If that librarian can easily access instances of a given event, we assume we have this heuristic that means that the event is more common. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. So, for example, a couple of problems. First, the retrievability error. There are a lot of things other than the actual representativeness or the actual availability of a given item that determine how retrievable it is. So, for example, news television and television programming increase the retrievability of certain types of situations, even though less sensational events are much more common. So, for example, we see that situational lethal events in one study, like botulism poisoning, tornado, flood, homicide, vehicle accidents, were rated as much more likely than quiet killers like asthma or diabetes or stomach cancer or heart disease. In spite of the fact that in the real world, if you look at actual rates of death from each of these things, stomach cancer, for instance, is 5 times more likely than homicide. But it's really easy when you think about murder. You all of a sudden have a million images in your head. You maybe know, you've seen a million episodes of CSI. Murder happens every week on CSI. It's very retrievable. And so you assume that it's more common. Stomach cancer, you may not have as many retrievable instances where you can think of someone who has suffered from stomach cancer. We also have this issue of false correlations. If you're told that a relationship exists, you will see that relationship whether it actually exists or not. And there's this really interesting study that was done, an illusory correlation study. And basically, what they did was they presented subjects with a set of drawings that looked something like this. So, supposedly, this is a drawing done by a mental patient. I actually drew this one. And this over here is an evaluation from a clinical psychologist. So this is what they told the subjects. They gave them actually 45 of these, different pictures, different evaluations. So here's a picture drawn by a mental patient, and here are 2 statements that a clinical psychologist has written. That's their diagnosis of this patient. So they had them look through 45 of these. And later, they asked subjects to estimate the frequency that each diagnosis had been accompanied by various features of the drawing. Features of the drawing would be things like atypical eyes, or distinctive hair, or emphasis of the mouth, or a large head, or emphasis of the head. And they set up these 45 pieces of paper with the drawing and the statements so that there was absolutely no relationship between drawing features and the diagnoses. So there actually was no relationship. But when they asked people, go ahead and tell us, for example, many of the subjects that you saw are worried about how intelligent they are. Which characteristics were most present in those particular drawings? And what they found was many would say that head emphasis. They have a bigger head because they're worried about this. Or if people were worried that they weren't very manly, then they would be big and muscular in the drawing. Those relationships didn't exist. But because people were told that some relationship existed between the drawing itself and these statements, they inferred that those relations existed. That's another problem with the availability heuristic. What we found from subsequent research is that the brain essentially stores things that support the theory and tosses aside contradictory information. So if we're told that there may be some relationship between a drawing and a diagnosis from a clinical psychologist, then we're going to infer that that relationship exists, whether it actually does or not. The third is what's known as anchoring and adjustment. The basic idea is that we extrapolate our final position according to an initial position, even if the latter is arbitrary. Let me give you an example. So, the problem that happens with anchoring and adjustment is what's called insufficient adjustment. And so, no matter what that initial value is, people don't adjust enough to come to a true value. So here's the example. There was this estimating study that was done. They would bring in a group of people and they would spin a wheel. And the wheel had numbers from 0 to 100 on it. So they spin this wheel, it comes up with a number, and they say, okay, so here's your number. Think of this as the anchor. Subjects didn't know this, but the anchor. So this is the number. I want you to tell me, is the number of African countries that are in the United Nations, the percentage of African countries that are in the United Nations, higher or lower than this number? And then I want you to estimate that number by moving up or down from this anchor. Let me explain that again. So they spin it, it's a totally random wheel, comes up with a number. And then they say, estimate the percentage of countries in Africa that are members of the United Nations. Tell me if this is higher or lower than this random number that we generated. And then go up or down from that number to come up with your actual estimate. Well, here's what they found. If people were given the random number of 10, their average estimate was that 25% of countries in Africa were members of the United Nations. If they were given the random number of 65, they estimated that 45% of African countries were in the United Nations, on average. This is an average of a lot of people. And so what this means is that even if we're given an arbitrary number, we anchor to that number, and we're afraid to stray too far from that number. I do a lot of research and consulting in the legal field, and I assist attorneys with making the best arguments they can for the particular case that they're doing. And one persistent finding in the field of legal decision-making is that if a plaintiff attorney asks for a damage award in court, it doesn't matter how high they go. The more they ask for, the more they will get if the jury awards a verdict. And that's because of this principle of anchoring and adjustment. If I ask for $50 million, even if you don't give me $50 million, you're going to give me more than if I asked for $10 million, because of this principle of anchoring and adjustment. And what's even weirder is there's no ceiling effect. I could ask for $100 bajillion, and all of the research that has been done is that it doesn't matter. There's no backlash. If we set the anchor, it doesn't matter how ridiculous it is, it will orient people to give higher amounts than if the anchor is lower. So let's bring it all back. What does this mean for scholars of communication? What does this mean for advertisers, people who are interested in advertising, the advertising industry? So Tversky and Kahneman, if you're interested in this idea, this article from 1979, they note that people are susceptible to heuristic bias. And as practitioners, we need to be wary of how very simple message features or message changes can predict decisions. So Tversky and Kahneman came up with this idea of what they call prospect theory. And within this idea are these ideas of risk aversion and risk seeking. So a person who is risk averse or in a state of risk aversion is going to avoid whatever the risk is. If they are a risk seeker, then they are going to go after that risk. They're going to engage in more risky behavior. We think of risk in terms of prospect theory as probability. So high risk might be 90% chance of failure. Low risk might be 1% chance of failure. So what does prospect theory say? The basic idea of prospect theory is that people are risk aversive. They will avoid risk when they are confronted with gains, and they will seek risk when they are confronted with losses. I'm going to show you a short video clip that will sort of explain this idea of prospect theory in a really clear and easy way.
Pete Furman is a magician. He can confuse, misdirect, and bamboozle.
So 51 are face up. Only one is face down. What was it? Seven of hearts. Seven of hearts. Take it out. Turn it face up. The seven of hearts. Oh. Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Today, Pete's in London's Spitalfields Market working for us, and he wants to give away our money.
Inside my pocket, I've got 20 quid, 20 pounds, 30, 40, 50 pounds. Feel it, touch it. You can walk away with that. Or, if you want to, we could have a little game of roulette, 50-50 odds, and you can up it to 50 quid. But if you lose, you get nothing. I get the 20 back.
The decision to take the 20 or gamble is theirs alone, except that what they don't know is that Pete is manipulating them.
Even odds. That's a trick, isn't it? No, it's not a trick. If you want to, you can walk around.
The way he presents the proposition is subtly different.
I'm going to give you 20 quid.
In the first case, the punter is presented with a freebie, a nice surprise. This is called a gain scenario.
Here's 20 quid. You take that. You can take that, you can walk away, it's yours. Go and buy lunch, whatever you want to do. Or you can gamble and maybe win 50. What do you want to do? Okay, I've got 10, 20...
In the second case, the punter gets an even nicer surprise.
Okay. Actually, wait a minute. Real money here, I've got 50 quid, all right? That's 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 quid. That's yours, okay?
But is then almost immediately presented with what is called a loss scenario.
I'm going to take 30 of it back. If you want to win this, you're going to have to gamble. What do you want to do?
The outcome to both scenarios is identical. Keep 20 or gamble for 50. We want to see if the decision to gamble can be affected by the way that the proposition is made.
I'll gamble.
You'll gamble?
I'll gamble.
Okay.
In our rigorously scientific study in Spitalfields Market, those who felt they were losing out were more likely to gamble to win the money back.
Red, Desmond, £50. Congratulations.
As opposed to those punters who were presented with a gain,
Here's 20 quid. All right?
who decided to stick with their unexpected good fortune.
I'm gonna keep the money.
You're going to keep the money? Well done. Fair enough, sir. Fair enough.
Without realizing it, our volunteers had decided on risk
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a red, so I'll keep the money.
or safety,
I'm gonna walk away.
You're going to walk away?
Yeah.
Fair enough. Have it my compliments.
simply because of perception of loss or gain.
So you saw in the video clip that just by changing the way the scenario was presented, the ultimate outcome was the same. You get 20 bucks, 20 quid, 20 pounds. This was done in Britain, so 20 pounds. And you can choose to gamble and either win 50 or win nothing. If you had the 20 in your hand, you were likely to just walk away with it. If, on the other hand, you were given 50 and then 30 was taken back, and you had to gamble to get that 30 back, you were more likely to gamble. This is the idea of loss framing versus gain framing. So people can react to the same information in very different ways depending on what ultimately are very subtle aspects of the message. Now, it may be, and some research has suggested, that risk and message framing interact. So if there's high risk that is gain framed, we're going to be averse to that risk. You've got 20 bucks in your hand. You might lose that. If you gamble, you're just going to walk away with it. On the other hand, if you had 50 and now you only have 20, you seem like you've lost that 30. You're going to be more likely to seek risk in that situation. Well, what's the big picture? Today we looked at 3 heuristics and some of the predictable errors that they cause. But we know that we're often guided by heuristics. We looked first at the idea of representativeness, and we saw how we might engage in stereotyping, where we're extrapolating incorrectly based on one or more features. We talked about misconceptions of regression, another example of the representative heuristic gone wrong, where original results are thought to be completely predictive of future results, even though that's not the case because of things like regression toward the mean. We talked about misconceptions of chance, where we often believe that a short sequence represents the essential characteristics of a process. We also talked about the availability heuristic, and underneath that, the retrievability error and false correlations, where we see relationships just because we're told they exist, or because something is easy to recall, we think it is more common or more likely event. And then we talked about adjustment and anchoring, where we will extrapolate our final position according to our initial position, even if that initial position is arbitrary. Any questions about the content today? All right, have a great weekend. We will see you again on Tuesday.